interesting to you to study ownership?
So I think the reason it's so interesting for me is because once you start thinking about it, you realize that it governs our behavior all the time. So like every single time, I think a good illustration is if you're walking through a parking lot, for example, or if you're walking through a park or on a beach, and anywhere, any public setting really. And if there is no such thing as ownership, then presumably you could help yourself to any of the objects around you. If you're walking through a wild forest and you see a nice rock, unless it's some kind of protected forest, you could just pick up the rock and take it. If you saw a nice pine cone, you could pick up and take it. If you saw a tree, although it wouldn't be very nice, you could carve into it, right? Like if there's no concern with ownership, probably these would be like normal things one could do. But when we're in the world of people and the world of ownership, all that goes out the window. So if I walk through your garden or someone's garden, I can't just pick up the rocks or the flowers in the garden. I can't carve into the tree if I'm in a classroom. So I think just realizing like all the different places that ownership, all the different ways that ownership affects our lives, and then we kind of like overlook is really makes it super interesting to study. And then it's not just that it affects our own behavior, it therefore affects our predictions about what other people will do and how they'll feel. And so it's this kind of pervasive force. And yet for a long time, it seems like people were sort of overlooking that and ignoring it. And they act like it's just this minor social convention when really it's everywhere. And then I'll say a second reason. I mean, you can edit this out if you want, but I think it also has all these consequences that we miss sight of. So like often when you think of ownership, it's that maybe theft and vandalism come to mind. So the idea is like, this is mine and you can't take it. But and if you did, you'd be a thief, and if you broke it, you might be a vandal. But aside from that kind of like idea of like ownership is controlling the resource and who gets to use it, there's all these other angles to it. So one example is it makes us like our possessions more, right? The endowment effect and the mere ownership effect. And so we don't even realize that it's maybe having these effects on us and how we feel, but then also it can make us responsible. So for example, if something of mine is involved in harm, people might look to me as someone who should apologize or pay some compensation. Like the obvious example is if my dog, I don't have a dog, bites someone. Even if I didn't train it to be vicious, any of these things. So I think that there's the continuing like discovery that ownership has like these huge effects everywhere and that we often overlook it. For me, that's what makes it most interesting to study.
Right. So out of all of those interesting findings, what was the most surprising finding to you, or the most fundamental, whatever you want to pick?
Yeah. I'll say two if that's okay. And one is from like my own research, and then the other is not even a finding. It's more like just a thing about ownership that I think we haven't really explored very much. And I don't know, have you seen this new book, Mine? How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives by Saltzman and Heller, or Salzman and Heller. So one thing that they've got a whole chapter on this, but and they call it attachment. But it really comes down to something that was called the law of accession. And it's the idea that sometimes the way we acquire things isn't because of anything we did, it's because of what we already have. Mm-hmm. So one example would be like if I have land and then we find some like gold under the land, even though I didn't know about the gold, it could, and people would generally think it's mine, even if someone else finds the gold, if it's under my land, somehow because it's like attached to my land. Mm-hmm. And I get, this is called like this principle of attachment, that if one thing is attached to something else, the owner of the first thing kind of comes to be viewed as the owner of the smaller thing that's attached, the accessory. And it goes all the way back to ancient law, like Romans talked about this, and then like David Hume writes about it. And then this law professor, Thomas Merrill, has a fantastic article about it, about this principle of accession. And then I think this book, Mine, How the Hidden Rules of Ownership Control Our Lives, has a terrific chapter on it. And it's an aspect of ownership that I was not aware of until just a couple of years ago, maybe. And it's kind of been haunting me ever since, because it's really like not a very rational rule, or it doesn't exactly feel rational. I'm not saying it's not rational, but it doesn't really feel rational. The idea that like, what we already own can make us own further things. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. I find it extremely thought-provoking. I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of conveying.
I wonder to which extent this is also kind of like inherent in the criticism brought forward by Marxism, right? It's kind of like that money makes money. So it's just a different type of possession then, but.
Yeah, no, that's right. And it actually leads to inequality. I mean, to the extent that people care about that, because right, it allows those who have to get more. That's right. And I mean, a clear example is just interest. So if I have a certain amount in the bank and it accrues interest, then this interest that was produced by the original amount is somehow like goes to me. But then I'll tell you about another finding, and this is a paper, it's currently under review. It's one of my papers. I think it's a surprising finding. And it's this, we know, and I talked about this before, like we know that like ownership can incur responsibility or confer responsibility. So if I own a tree and it falls on your car, I might have to pay money, or my insurance company might have to pay money for the damage caused to your car. Again, my property is causing responsibility. But I've got recent findings, which I still don't know how to think about, but there they are, that suggest that sometimes our need to hold people responsible makes us view them as owners.
Right.
So I'll give an example. Let's say a factory makes, or a mining company makes a byproduct, some kind of like residue that they produce, and it's harmless. It looks like rocks and it's totally harmless. And they go to an island and they do some mining on this island, and it produces this residue, and the residue is totally harmless. Maybe it's even good for the plants and animals. It's actually nutritious for them, and they thrive. If we ask people, when the mining company leaves, do they own this residue that they produced? People say no, it looks like rocks, it's harmless, fine. It doesn't belong to them. But if we said that the residue is poisoning the animals and trees, now people actually say that they do own it.
Right.
And so this is this idea that the idea of who owns a thing is somehow hinging on whether it was good or bad, which relates to Josh Knob's work on, the side effect, but it's similar. But the main point, I guess, in this is just that somehow or other we're using ownership attributions, or the mind is using ownership attributions to say this person has to do something. They've done something wrong, and we want to hold them responsible. So I think that's a pretty surprising finding.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And it's kind of like it's highlighting this fact that, ownership attributions are a phenomenon all by themselves that have a purpose for humans that goes beyond the experience of ownership. And
that's right. That's right.
So it's kind of like there's those two different layers, and probably more. Very interesting. So kind of like, and I think your answer to that question has already implied some answers also to the next question, and that's, where do you see the role of ownership, property, possession, whatever aspect you look at, in the big societal issues we are facing? Pick out anything you want, because I mean, it can be comprehensive.
You can't be comprehensive. In fact, I don't know. I mean, you can almost ask, is there any issue it doesn't come up in? Because, like, so in the States, for example, gun ownership, should it be legal or not? Or should there be restrictions? Is always an ownership issue. Immigration can be viewed as an ownership issue, especially because of the work of m.core. I'm probably saying the name wrong, but like the idea that like if I view this as my homeland, or the citizens as the owners of a house, and then immigrants are guests who are permitted inside. If that's how people construe immigration, then all of immigration issues become an ownership issue, at least psychologically, right? In terms of psychological ownership, even if legally it's not necessarily that way. Of course, all of intellectual property law and data privacy, all of that comes down to a form of ownership. And if you think of body ownership, which you can decide if you want to think that ownership extends to like this film, that this is my hand, is a kind of ownership, then even things like vaccine mandates become ownership issues, because I'm being compelled what to do with my body. So I don't know that there's a place that the psychology of ownership does not turn up, actually.
Right. That's exactly how I see it too. That makes it so interesting, right? So,
yep, exactly. That's right.
So then I'm already coming to my last question, and that was a personal one. And that's kind of like, what's your most valued possession? And interpret again the terms that I'm using here as freely as you want.
Yeah, well, I assume you don't mean the most financially valuable. So I'm going to probably assume it's somehow like the most emotional value, the possession that's most important to me. And I'm going to be boring here. Like maybe everyone would say this, but for me, it would be like family photos and family videos. Like videos of like my children when they're young, like are clearly the most valuable things I have. I think you asked, would I share it with someone? I don't know what that means. Like, would I show you the picture? For sure. Would I somehow like lend a photo album? I mean, they're all virtual now, so it doesn't really come up anymore. But I think for me, those would have to be the most valuable. But I think that's a very like probably stereotypical answer.
You're the first one giving it to me out of those people that I've been interviewing already. It's so super exciting also to do those interviews. I'm enjoying it much more than I thought I would, because it gives me a chance to see you guys again.
Yeah.
And that's immensely pleasurable. But also it's kind of like so interesting, right? Same questions, same kind of like stack of knowledge, more or less. So everybody has their own take on it, right? And everybody has different depths of reading and different areas that they cover. Like, you know, you're one of the the broadest readers on the matter that I know of, alongside Russ Belk, I think, and Floyd Rudman. So but everybody comes up with somewhat different answers, and it's always surprising to me. So actually, last question to you: is there anything else you kind of like to share and maybe get in there?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I can't think of anything. I never can think on the spot. Well, I can, but not about this kind of thing. I don't think there's anything else that I can think of, except for not for an interview. I was going to ask you though what your most valuable possession was. What is your? Can I ask?
Well, actually, it was not children's videos, and your actually made me realize that maybe I've changed in a way, so that right now I don't have any valuable possessions anymore, right? So it's kind of like I don't care about things that much anymore. I mean, obviously, I'm sad to lose certain things, and it's kind of like my little housey is like a little bit of a safe spot, retreat that I really value. And then the thing that I value most and call mine is my son, even so that's not a possession at all, right? And I feel more stewardship than ownership for him.
Yeah, no, if I can include my kids, then of course they would replace their photos.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's interesting, right? I think this, actually, I think that's another topic that's just super interesting, is the extent to which like objects can be replacements for people.
Yeah, there is something on it.
Yeah, I've got a student who's interested in that topic, and I just think it's got a lot of legs, you know, like maybe that's behind the idea of attachment objects, right? That some of them stand for the mother or something like that. But I think the phenomenon is probably much more widespread. I don't know if someone's written about it. Probably someone's written about it and I'm just forgetting. Okay, Bernadette, great talking to you and seeing you too.